Hey guys, Luna here, and welcome to my little introduction on creating a character for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition that was released in 2014, since this is a thing that I was most experienced with, especially since a lot of people are, or people that I know are at least familiar with it. Now, there's a handful of things that go into creating a character, at least for Dungeons & Dragons. There are sets, backgrounds, species/races, depending on how you're most familiar with them, and all that kind of things. But one of the most important things that comes for creating a character is the stats, which are strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. Most commonly known for a variety of different things. The basic overview of each of the stats is strength is how well you're able to smash a tomato. The dexterity, and also for strength, is how many tomatoes you're able to carry at once. Dexterity is how well you're able to throw a tomato, how well you're able to juggle them, and how well you're able to be avoiding them. Constitution is how well you're able to eat a rotten tomato. Intelligence is knowing that tomato is a fruit and not a veggie. Wisdom is knowing to put a tomato in a veggie salad versus a fruit salad. And charisma is how well you're able to sell a tomato. Now, of course, different classes need different stats. And there's multiple different ways to get a variety of different stats, but the most common ways are with point buy and with rolling stats. Now, there's a couple more that I'm sure that exist out there, but these are the two most common ways that I've seen at least. And this is before racial traits are applied, since at least in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, races or species provide an additional stat, typically a +2 in one stat and a +1 in another stat. And you have a breakdown of a minimum of 8 in a stat and a maximum of 15 in a stat, and there's how many points you're able to spend. Some DMs may allow more, some DMs may allow less, but typically it's about 27 points. And from this, usually there is a couple common builds that come out of this. The two that I've seen that I'm experienced with is 8 and 3 stats, usually called your dump stats, or stats that a specific class might not use, and 15 in 3 stats are the main ones that your class would use. For example, with spellcasters, usually you want your spellcasting ability, usually an intellect stat, so intelligence, wisdom, or charisma, and you want constitution for health, and you would want dexterity to be able to have a better armor class. And the other is for a jack of all trades, master of none, having 12 in 5 stats and 14 in another. And from sort of like general breakdown, this leaves a range of 69 to 74, 72 to 77 with racial breakdowns, which doesn't leave too much of a variety between player to player, since generally speaking, they're all going to have kind of a similar sort of layout, which is why I personally prefer rolling stats, which there's a couple of different ways to go about it, but a few most common things that I've seen is rolling 4 6-sided dice, and I will be referring to it as 4d6 going forward. Remove the lowest, or one of the lowest numbers, such as if you roll 2 2s, a 4, and a 6, you would remove one of the 2s and add them together. The second is rolling 3d6 and adding the numbers together, so very similar to 4d6. The next is rolling 4d6, drop the lowest, and re-rolling any ones that show up. Next is 4d6, drop the lowest, and take a note, and then do it like a certain number of times, such as like 3 times, and choosing the one you want. So basically, instead of doing it just once, you do it like 3 times. And then one that I actually came up with, which I don't know if it's actually been used before, but I imagine probably it's come up for chaos or other varieties of things, is rolling 6 d20s, because a stat can technically be between 1 and 20 for at least a player class. And then there's a couple different ways to assign. If you're doing the 60-20 or 46 or any other way. Usually you choose what stat you go on into, such as if you get 3 15s, a 14, a 13, and 12, you just choose wherever the stats go. Or if you happen to choose ordered rolling, there is... Actually, I need to fix this, since this is technically a different way to go about this. But the other way is, first you roll for strength, then dexterity, then constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. So basically, if you roll a 15 for strength, then a 15 would be strength. If you roll a 12 next, then 12 would go in your strength. If you roll an 18 for constitution, so on and so forth. Obviously, this leaves for a much larger range, being 18 being 3 in each stat, to 108 being 18 in each stat, assuming that you're doing the 3d6 or 4d6 strategy, not the 60-20 strategy. And if you're going with ruling, typically there is, not always, but most DMs usually would, if talking with them, usually allow for at least a minimum stat total. So for example, if you add in all 6 of your stats and it's less than 70, then usually the DMs would allow you to reroll. Well, it depends. 60 is the absolute minimum a stat should be, because that would be 10 in each stat, and that's similar to a commoner. And if you have less than a commoner, that usually means you're not going to be a hero, or you're going to perish sooner rather than later. So, from the DMs that I've experienced, a DM is a dungeon master, or also known as GM or game master. So most game masters typically say at least aim for 60. I typically say go for at least 70 and above, because that's at least a 12 in each stat, depending on how the stats break down, and that proves you're at least cut above the average commoner. And most DMs usually don't apply a maximum, but like if most players are in like the 70s to 80s range of stats, and a person got like 100 in average, like 100 plus and above in their stats, then the DM might say, hey, try and go a little bit lower in 1 or 2 of your stats to help for a little bit of variety, especially since a lower stat, such as a low charisma stat, can help play up to characters' flaws. For example, if a character has extremely low intelligence, they might not be able to recognize certain things in the environment, or might not act appropriately in front of different people, because they're like, I don't know, it says something dumb like, I think you look really nice, or something, I don't know. Just something that they might blurt out something that a person might not normally say. Or if they have really low strength, they might attempt to lift up a super heavy rock but fail horribly. It's just fun character moments that doesn't usually come up if a character has super high stats. And yeah, so just a thing to keep in mind. Now, stats usually are the thing that determines classes, at least with starting off at level 1. And of course, there's some exceptions that come into play. If there's like homebrew classes or homebrew subclasses or anything like that, might affect it a little bit. And some DMs might allow for some fun flavor. For example, one of my 2 favorite characters that I've made over the years. One was a rogue with super low stealth, but super high charisma and super high strength. So, in case they ever got caught, they basically intimidated any person they come across of, you don't see me, you will just pretend you never saw me in the first place. And it was super fun. Like, a lot of people had a lot of laughs because it's so uncharacteristic of rogues to have a super low dexterity. And I also recently created a paladin that had high dex, average strength, instead of high strength and average or low dexterity, because I thought it was much more fitting, and since they were more designed to be kind of like, not exactly a roguish in style, but more of a slender bill kind of get up behind enemies and surprise them rather than be up in their face. Now, each class requires different sort of things based off of different abilities and features. For example, an artificer, their main stat is intelligence. They use it for basically everything. Tinkering, which is a feature they have, spellcasting, fusions, flash of genius, and certain subclass features. Constitution is another stat that they need, again, for health. Going forward, just for pretty much all classes want Constitution because health is good, and it's good for frontliners, and spellcasters want Constitution because concentration checks, which basically means can they maintain concentration on a spell. So I'll probably miss going over Constitution. And again, strength and dexterity used for similar purposes, but strength is only used for certain weapons, while dexterity is used for weapons and for armor. So going forward, assume that most of the time that classes will either need Constitution and either strength or dexterity based off of the class, unless I specify otherwise. But yeah, Artificer's main stat is intelligence, and to multi-class into it, you need intelligence of 13. Barbarian is a full-out kind of melee class, like the tank of the thing. Strength, very good for rage weapons, and their armor is derived from dexterity and from Constitution. So the stereotype of the class is that they're very dumb because their dumb stats are all of the 3 mental stats: intelligence, wisdom, and charisma, unless they happen to roll really well. Bards are the charmers of the group, so their main stat is charisma. Bloodhunters are a homebrew class that's become more and more popular thanks to Critical Role. It's kind of an unusual class because they can either use strength or dexterity for both if they're weapons, and they also have different varieties of armor as well, which they can use either dexterity or strength for. And then their spellcasting, kind of spellcasting. Their Blood, Curse, and Hunter's Bane require either intelligence or wisdom based on the player. So they have kind of a unique setup. Clerics, their main stat is for wisdom. And one thing to note is that bards only have a certain select spell, and charisma-based casters usually only get a select number of spells, while non-charisma spellcasters prepare a number of spells based off of their class level and their spellcasting modifier, so a max of 25 spells, with some exceptions. Bards, minimum, I think their total spells at level 20, I think, is 22, or 23. Clerics, druids, and wizards have a max of 25. Druids' main stats is kind of a unique situation as well, because they can wild shape, which means they take on the physical stats, strength, dexterity, and constitution of the animal they take into. And there's 2 different builds that go into druids. One of which is the wild shapes subclasses, which focuses on their wild shapes, and then there's the spellcasting focus subclasses, which focus more so on using spells. So depending on what build of druid that you want to go for determines what stats you should determine for druid. Wisdom is the one guaranteed stat that you would want for a druid, because it determines your spellcasting, and that's just important all around. And you can retain your mental stats in your wild shape. So, again, having good wisdom always helps. Now, Constitution is more important if you're doing a more specific spellcasting focus rather than a wild shape focus. Again, as I said previously, due to wild shape. Now, intelligence and charisma are more important if you're doing a wild shape focus rather than a spellcasting focus, because, as I said, based off of retaining your mental stats, being able to maintain a high intelligent charisma is good for spell save DCs or spell save difficulties. Now, fighters are kind of in a similar boat, but kind of have a all-around capabilities depending on what you want to go into. Fighters are like the druids of spellcasters. You pretty much have the full-on flexibility of doing whatever you want based on your fighting style that you want to go for. You can either do strength for the weapon you prefer using, you can do dexterity for weapons and armor, you can do, obviously, constitution's always important, especially if you're a frontliner, and certain subclasses actually use charisma as well, so that's also very important to have. And it's one of the only class that you can use either strength or dexterity to multi-class into. Sort of similar to Bloodhunter, which needed strength or dexterity, but you also needed intelligence and wisdom as well. Now, Monk is in a unique position where it's similar to Barbarian, where they have an unarmored defense with wisdom and dexterity, but the unfortunate thing is Barbarians only need strength to be able to go into their class, while monks need both dexterity and wisdom, because for their wisdom is also determined for the key, which allows for certain additional benefits, like a stunning strike, which potentially is a stun on the opponent, or ability to gain additional movement or additional attacks. And Paladin is a strength and charisma based fighter, which technically speaking, depending on the DM, which may allow swapping of certain items and stuff, for the most part at level 1, if there's no swaps, you need strength for the starting armor that you get, and charisma for your AC, for spells and everything else, which is actually the one exception to the charisma-based spellcaster spell limit, which they actually base off of spell. There's spell level based off the paladin level and the charisma modifier. Now, rangers are the unique exception for non-charisma spellcasters, which have a limit of number of spells that they can learn, which they are a dexterity wisdom based class, and kind of a running joke of being one of the worst classes, because with the exception of, for attacking wise, the fighter is a much better ranger than a ranger is, because a fighter has better armor, better access to a bunch of different weapons, and gets a lot more ability score improvements overall. So, plus fighters has multi-attack. Well, gets more attacks at later levels. I don't remember the max level it is. I think it's 18, but at the very least 20. They have 4 attacks, while Ranger, I believe, only gets 2 at level 5. So, overall, fighter is a better ranged fighter. And with spellcasting, besides for the exception of tracking and a few certain spells, a druid is a much better ranger in terms of spellcasting, because I think 95 of the spells that a ranger gets, a druid gets. So, for the most part, it's just better to go druid if you want to do spellcasting. Plus, it doesn't help that a ranger gets limited number of spells rather than prepared number of spells based off of level and the wisdom modifier. Now, rogue is a very fun class that I like doing on occasion, because for the most part, you can pretty much do whatever you want to. It's just that, at least statistically speaking, dexterity is the stat you want to go for being your highest stat, because armor, using light armor, is better overall for rogue. Your weapons are typically going to be dexterity, and I think sneak attack is based off of dexterity. Many skills associated with rogue, stealth, sleight of hand, picking locks, and that sort of thing, are typically associated with rogues rather than any other class, just like how bards' stereotypical skill that's associated with them is persuasion. And either you want charisma or intelligence, as many subclasses of rogue uses either, well, not many, but a handful of subclasses of rogue uses either charisma or intelligence with the thing. So like Arcane Trickster uses intelligence, Swashbuckler Rogue uses charisma. So it just kind of depends on what you want to go with. Both are good for rogues just because investigation usually falls under intelligence, which is what you do for searching for traps. Charisma is good for deception and persuasion. So, while not directly important because of the main class, you might not necessarily use them. It's just that common skills usually associated with rogues and situations that they get with, it's good to have it. Now, sorcerers are kind of in a unique situation because they only need a charisma and constitution because spellcasting ability and health and concentration. But certain subclasses, spells, and their AC can benefit from dexterity. So typically, if you are not wearing armor, it is 10 plus your dexterity modifier. And like I said, mentioned with spells, there is a I think it's called shield gets +5 to your AC, and there is, I don't remember what the spell is off the top of my head, but the spell, it basically says you get 13 plus your dexterity modifier instead of 10 plus your dexterity modifier. And one of the subclasses called the Draconic Bloodline provides 13 plus your dexterity modifier as well. So that is just a little bit added benefit to rogues, or to sorcerers. And with the warlocks, are kind of in a sort of similar situation as sorcerers, but they do get access to armors. So one of the benefits is that they can wear armor, so they can use dexterity to their advantage. They are able to use certain strength-based weapons, so strength could be useful. Additionally, charisma is just going to be their main stat. They have a limited amount of spells known, plus a limited amount of spell slots, much lower than the rest of the spellcasting cast. And certain warlock features, such as an evocation and just subclasses, grant benefits based off of the charisma modifier. And finally, wizards are the most similar to sorcerers in terms of stat breakdown. They don't get access to armor, but get spells and certain subclasses benefits from in dexterity, same with attacking, and their intelligence determines their spells and spell breakdown. Now, as you probably saw on the end of each of the classes, I provided the multi-class abilities, and the general breakdown, if you include Blood Hunter and Artificer, some might because they are technically not in the player's handbook, is that there are 4 strength-based classes, 5 dexterity classes, 5 wisdom classes, 4 intelligence classes, and 4 charisma-based classes. Now, if you do not include Blood Hunter, that lowers down some of these numbers, like just to all of these. And if you lower down, remove Artificer. Actually, this should only be 1 if you remove Artificer, because I think there's only 2. Yeah, because there's only 3 classes that technically need intelligence. So without intelligence, only 1 class needs it, which is the wizard. Which it's kind of funny that you only, from the base core classes, only 1 class needs it, and more classes rely heavily on wisdom, charisma, and dexterity, kind of giving strength and intelligence the short end of the stick. Now, the last few things that kind of help determine a class is a race. Now, in 5th edition, races or species typically give +2 in one stat and +1 in another stat. Of course, there are some exceptions, like normal humans, without the variant human and all that, give +1 in all stats. Some give +1 in 3 stats, so on and so forth. It just kind of depends. But typically speaking, the average class gives +2 in one and +1 in another, and they also give additional features. And from my experience, players tend to choose races based off of one of the 3 following things. The stat increases, so for example, +2 in strength, +1 in constitution, you might go into a barbarian because that's fairly good at barbarian breakdown. Or you might go into fighter because both of those classes need use strength and use constitution. Now, if you're an elf, you have a couple different subclasses, such as the main stat being +2 to dexterity, but some of the subclasses provide +1 to intelligence, +1 to wisdom. So you might go into like a cleric or a wizard or a druid because of that +1, or you might even go into rogue because of that +2 in dexterity. Now, some people also choose based off a specific class feature, or maybe they haven't used the class before and they just want to try it. For example, I recently built an Artificer Warforged, and I think the subclass I chose was an Envoy, because I chose Warforged because I haven't used one before, and I thought, hey, the stat lineup is actually quite useful for an Artificer, and which was another class I haven't used before, so it was 2 kind of things that worked well together. And finally, people tend to pick classes and races based off of world lore. For example, if there is no clerics in the world, for example, like in the D&D movie that got released, I think it was last year, clerics have the ability to cast resurrection, but the party, obviously this is spoilers, the party was looking for a artifact that allowed for resurrection, which, if only they knew a cleric. So, but in that kind of thing, if you take the D&D movie and apply it to a D&D campaign, the DM might restrict people playing clerics because of that restriction and make it a little bit more realistic. But yeah, there's also the character's backgrounds, which in a background provides certain benefits, such as background features such as, oh yeah, I have a military rank, so people of other military ranks might recognize me, or they might be interested in the abilities such as learning 2 languages or being able to become proficient in sleight of hand checks or something. Some DMs might allow for swapping of certain attributes to different things based on what makes the most sense for the character, but typically speaking, like the overview of a background kind of goes hand in hand with the character's backstory. For example, if you are playing a rogue who grew up super rich, they might play a noble because of them raising up with a rich family. Or if their parents were out of the picture, they might choose the orphan background because they're out of the picture. Of course, many of the Game Master's rulings and world obviously is one of the most important things to keep in mind, because you don't want to play a level 20 Warforged Artificer if this is medieval times and you're starting off as peasants. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. And of course, it also is based off of your personality as well. I personally don't like using summons, so like summon elementals, summon face spirits, that kind of thing, unless it's like summon familiar that I just use on occasion, because of the fact that I don't like having to try and manage all of those summons. Plus, having to manage so many different creatures or getting the stat blocks, having the DM being like, oh yeah, let me manage them instead. It's just too much of a hassle, it takes too much of the time, and it's just too much of a pain. But I hope you guys at least enjoyed kind of this introduction of D&D character lore building, just because, hey, I want to get people more interested in Dungeons & Dragons, or at least familiarity with this. And I hope you guys have a good day, night, week, month of your lives, and may the stars forever guide your path wherever it might lead you into the future. Bye everybody, and hope to see you guys again soon.